On a homestead where the Canadian border lay close enough to taste the Arctic wind, a Finnish widow was still digging her tunnel in late October while her neighbors had long since finished their winter preparations. They called her the Mole Woman. They called her touched by grief. While everyone else trusted their legs and their courage to carry them the 60 yards between house and barn, she had spent 4 months excavating a passage that ran beneath the frozen prairie like a secret. Her neighbors gathered at the general store in Havre to discuss her foolishness with the patient contempt reserved for those who didn't understand how things were done on the frontier. The local cattle buyer, a man named Hendricks who had survived 15 Montana winters, said she was wasting time that should go toward stacking hay. The other homesteaders' wives whispered that losing her husband to the wolves last spring had broken something inside her, that she was building a grave for herself instead of accepting the life the prairie demanded. They couldn't understand why any sensible woman would spend a summer moving dirt when the distance from house to barn was barely a minute's walk. In this country, where men prided themselves on facing the cold head-on, hiding underground seemed like cowardice dressed up as preparation. But that fool woman's tunnel, the one they said would collapse or flood or prove utterly useless, it would save her entire herd when the killing cold came. A cold so deep that it would freeze cattle standing upright in their tracks. A cold that would turn the 60 yards between house and barn into a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to try walking it. What did she understand about wind chill, whiteout navigation, and the mathematics of survival that made her underground passage the difference between a living herd and 50 frozen carcasses? The widow's name was Helmi Korhonen. She had come to Montana Territory with her husband Aino in the autumn of 1884, drawn by the promise of open range and grass that grew thick enough to support cattle through the long winters. Aino had been a miner in the copper country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula before that, a man who understood what it meant to work below the surface, to move through spaces carved from the earth itself. He had spent his youth in tunnels, and he had taught Helmi that the ground offered protection the sky could never match. When the wolves took him, a pack that had grown bold during a hard winter and caught him alone while checking fence lines, Helmi had buried him on the hillside above their cabin and made herself a promise. She would not die the way he had died, caught in the open with no protection and no escape. She would build the tunnel he had sketched in his journal, the one he had planned to dig that coming summer. She would finish what he had started, even if she had to move every shovelful of earth herself. Her neighbors were building for speed and building for pride. The common approach throughout the territory was simple and direct. Place your barn within easy walking distance of your house. Trust your ability to endure brief exposures to extreme cold, and rely on courage and determination to see you through the worst storms. These homesteaders moved quickly between buildings, spending no more than a minute or two in the open air even during the harshest weather. They figured that any storm they couldn't walk through wasn't worth preparing for, because such storms were rare enough to be dismissed as freak occurrences. The theory was sound for ordinary winters. The execution would prove fatal when the extraordinary arrived. Montana winters brought cold that settlers from gentler climates couldn't imagine. Temperatures of 20 below zero were common. 30 below happened several times each season. 40 below occurred during the worst cold snaps, usually accompanied by winds that multiplied the cold's killing power through a phenomenon the old-timers called the White Death. Wind chill that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes and turn a short walk into a death march. But what arrived in January of 1887 was something beyond ordinary cold, something beyond even the worst the old-timers had witnessed. A mass of Arctic air, pushed south by pressure systems that aligned in ways no one could predict, descended on the northern plains with temperatures that would later be recorded at 70 degrees below zero when wind chill was calculated. The actual thermometer readings touched 52 below in Havre. The wind made it worse, so much worse that the numbers lost meaning. At 70 below, exposed skin froze in 30 seconds. Lungs burned from breathing air that cold. Eyes watered and froze shut. The human body simply wasn't designed to function in such conditions, not even for the brief time required to walk 60 yards across open ground. Helmi had spent the previous summer preparing for exactly this possibility. The excavation had begun in late May, after the ground thawed enough to accept a shovel. The passage would run in a straight line from the northwest corner of her root cellar to the feed room of her barn, a distance of 187 feet that she measured with a length of rope and marked with stakes driven deep into the prairie soil. The tunnel needed to be deep enough to stay below the frost line and avoid the drifting snow that could bury a shallow trench, but not so deep as to require timbering beyond her carpentry skills and limited lumber supply. After studying the drainage patterns around her buildings during spring runoff, she settled on a depth of 6 feet, enough clearance for her to walk upright without stooping, deep enough to maintain consistent temperature regardless of surface conditions. The extra depth, compared to what most men would have dug, reflected her understanding of Montana's particular challenges. Snow here didn't just fall. It drifted in waves that could bury a one-story building overnight. A shallow tunnel would become a shallow grave when the first serious blizzard packed the entrance solid. The work proceeded in sections during the early morning hours before her other chores began. Helmi would dig 8 to 10 feet of trench each day, removing roughly 2.5 tons of prairie soil that she carefully piled to form windbreaks around her barn foundation. The excavated earth wasn't waste. It became part of the overall weather protection system, creating berms that would redirect snow away from the barn doors and provide additional insulation against the driving wind. The digging itself was brutal labor that left her arms aching and her back screaming for rest. Prairie soil was not soft. It was laced with roots and rocks, compacted by thousands of years of buffalo hooves and summer drought. Some days she moved barely 6 feet. Some days she hit stones that required hours of work with a pry bar before they would budge. But every evening she measured her progress with the rope, calculating how many days remained until the passage would be complete. Her neighbors watched from a distance, shaking their heads at the sight of a woman moving dirt like a railroad laborer. Some offered to help, though their offers carried the unspoken suggestion that she should abandon the foolish project rather than waste more effort on it. Others simply laughed when they passed her claim, pointing at the growing pile of earth and the trench that stretched a little longer each week. Helmi thanked the helpful ones politely and ignored the rest. She had learned from Aino that explaining engineering to people who didn't want to understand was a waste of breath, better spent on labor. The structural requirements demanded careful attention to details that her neighbors would never have considered. Every 4 feet along the trench, Helmi installed vertical support posts cut from lodgepole pine, 8-inch diameter timbers sunk 2 feet into undisturbed soil and extending to the roof planking above. Between these posts, she fitted horizontal boards to prevent soil cave-ins, using lumber she had hauled from the sawmill in Havre and paid for with money that should have gone toward next year's cattle purchases. The expense troubled her, but not enough to stop. Aino had always said that money spent on safety was money that paid for itself when trouble arrived. The neighbors who mocked her expenditures would learn the truth of that principle soon enough. The roofing system required the most careful engineering. Helmi laid 3-inch planks across the trench at 12-inch intervals, creating a deck strong enough to support not just the weight of packed earth above, but the additional load of snow that would accumulate during winter storms. Over this planking, she spread a layer of tar paper purchased at considerable expense from the general store, necessary to prevent water infiltration that would turn the passage into a frozen death trap during the freeze-thaw cycles of early spring. Finally, she covered the entire length with 18 inches of prairie sod cut in uniform blocks and fitted together to create a living roof that would shed water while providing insulation. The sod would grow together over the summer, creating a seamless surface that would be nearly invisible by the time winter arrived. Drainage represented the most critical element of the design. Helmi pitched the passage floor at a grade of 1 inch per 6 feet of length, sloping downward from the house toward a gravel-filled sump near the barn end. This seemingly minor detail would prevent snowmelt and groundwater from accumulating in the passage, where it would freeze into ice that could make the tunnel impassable precisely when it was needed most. At the house end, she constructed a proper entrance through the floor of her root cellar. A trap door fitted with rope hinges and a wooden latch that could be operated even with mittened hands. At the barn end, the tunnel emerged into the feed room through a similar door set into the foundation wall, positioned so that it would remain accessible even if snow drifted against the barn's exterior. By late September, the passage was complete but untested. Helmi walked its length in the cool autumn air, checking the support posts for settling, examining the roof planks for signs of moisture, testing the drainage by pouring buckets of water at the high end, and watching it flow toward the sump. Everything functioned as designed. The tunnel was ready. The first real test came during a November storm that dropped temperatures to 35 below zero and brought winds that rattled the windows in their frames. Helmi's neighbors struggled through the blowing snow to reach their barns, returning with frostbitten faces and fingers that would ache for weeks. 2 homesteaders lost calves that night when they couldn't reach the animals in time to bring them into shelter. Helmi simply opened her trap door and walked to her barn in the calm, protected air of her tunnel. The temperature underground held steady at 28 degrees, cold enough to require a coat, but survivable for hours if necessary. She fed her cattle, checked the water supply, and returned to her house without ever exposing herself to the killing wind above. The neighbors heard about her success and dismissed it as unnecessary. 35 below was cold, they admitted, but survivable for a quick walk if a person dressed properly and moved with purpose. A tunnel might help, but it wasn't worth the effort of building one. Any real homesteader could handle a little cold. Then January arrived. The morning of January 9th, 1887, began like any winter day on the Montana prairie. Helmi stepped outside at dawn to check the sky, finding it clear with only a light wind from the northwest. The thermometer nailed to her kitchen door frame read 12 above zero, cold but manageable. She could see the mountains to the west, a sign that the weather would hold for at least another day. By noon, the sky had begun to change. A line of clouds appeared on the northern horizon, darker than any clouds Helmi had seen before, moving with a speed that seemed unnatural. The wind picked up, shifting from northwest to due north, carrying a cold that bit through her coat like it wasn't there. By 2 o'clock, the clouds had swallowed the sky. The temperature had dropped to 15 below and was still falling. The wind had become a constant scream, driving snow that seemed to materialize from the air itself rather than falling from above. By 4 o'clock, the world outside had ceased to exist. Helmi stood at her kitchen window and saw nothing. Not her barn 60 yards away, not her fence posts 10 feet from the house, not even the ground beneath the snow. The white was absolute, a void that had replaced the familiar landscape with something that didn't seem possible. The thermometer read 42 below zero, but the wind made that number meaningless. The cold out there was beyond measurement, beyond anything the instrument had been designed to record. She opened her trapdoor and descended into the tunnel. The passage was dark, lit only by the lantern she carried, but the air was calm and almost warm compared to the howling death above. The temperature held at 26 degrees, the earth itself providing insulation against the cold that was killing everything on the surface. Helmi walked the length of the tunnel in 5 minutes, emerging into her barn's feed room to find her cattle restless but alive. The animals needed water. Their trough had begun to freeze despite the relative warmth of the enclosed barn. Helmi broke the ice with an axe and hauled buckets from the hand pump, which still functioned because she had insulated the pipe with straw and burlap as Aino had taught her. She distributed hay, checked each animal for signs of cold stress, and spoke to them in the low Finnish words her mother had used with livestock back in the old country. Then she returned through the tunnel to her house, made herself a meal, and waited for the storm to end. It didn't end for 3 days. For 72 hours, the wind screamed across the Montana prairie, with temperatures that touched 52 below zero on the sheltered side of buildings and 70 below in the wind chill of open ground. Snow piled in drifts that buried fence posts and covered the lower windows of houses. Visibility remained zero, not reduced, not limited, but absolutely zero, a white blindness that made navigation impossible by any means other than touch. The sound was the worst part, not the wind itself, though that was terrible enough, a constant shriek that rose and fell but never stopped, a noise that invaded dreams and made sleep nearly impossible. The worst sound was the silence from outside. No cattle lowing, no horses whinnying, no dogs barking. The cold had silenced everything that lived above ground, and the silence was the sound of death spreading across the prairie one heartbeat at a time. Helmi made the trip through her tunnel every 4 hours, day and night. She fed and watered her cattle. She monitored the temperature in the barn and adjusted the ventilation to prevent the respiratory problems that killed livestock in sealed buildings during extended storms. She broke ice from the water trough and hauled feed from the supplies she had stacked in the feed room the previous fall. She talked to the animals in Finnish, keeping her voice calm, letting them know that someone was still there to care for them, even when the world above had become a frozen hell. On the second night, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A scratching at the barn's outer wall, something trying to get in. She took her rifle and waited, but the scratching stopped. In the morning, she found tracks in the snow that had drifted against the foundation. Wolf tracks. A pack that had survived the cold and was looking for anything still alive to eat. They had smelled her cattle through the walls, but couldn't find a way in. They were gone by the time the storm ended, driven south by hunger and desperation. Her neighbors, the ones who had mocked her tunnel as the project of a grief-maddened woman, were fighting for their lives. Hendricks, the cattle buyer who had said she was wasting time, tried to reach his barn on the second morning of the storm. He made it 20 yards before the wind knocked him down and the cold began freezing his exposed face. His wife found him by following the rope he had tied around his waist, dragging him back inside with frostbite that would cost him 3 fingers and part of his left ear. His cattle went without water for the duration of the storm. 11 of them died. The Gustafson family, a Swedish couple with 4 children whose homestead lay 2 miles east of Helmi's claim, lost their entire herd, 37 cattle frozen in a barn that the family couldn't reach to provide water or adjust ventilation. The animals had suffocated on the moisture from their own breath, the sealed building becoming a death chamber when the condensation froze and blocked what little airflow the structure provided. Old Morrison, a Scottish rancher who had survived 20 Montana winters and claimed to have seen everything the territory could produce, tried to walk the 40 yards between his house and his barn, using a rope guideline he had strung during a break in the wind. The rope snapped when ice accumulated on the fibers faster than his grip could clear it. Morrison was found the next spring, frozen solid in a drift 60 yards from his own door, turned completely around by winds that had spun him like a compass needle until he walked in the wrong direction and never found his way back. Across the northern territories, the death toll mounted. Cattle died by the thousands, not from cold alone, but from abandonment when their owners couldn't reach them, through conditions that made the 60-yard walk between house and barn as dangerous as crossing an ocean. Horses froze, standing upright, their legs locked in position by cold that killed faster than they could fall. Sheep suffocated in drifts that buried them alive. People died too. Homesteaders who thought they could make it. Children who wandered from schoolhouses when the storm struck without warning. Travelers caught between towns with no shelter and no hope of finding any in the white blindness that had swallowed the world. The final count would never be precise. Too many bodies weren't found until spring, and too many deaths in isolated homesteads went unrecorded entirely. But the estimates ran into the hundreds, and the livestock losses approached numbers that seemed impossible until you saw the frozen carcasses dotting the prairie when the snow finally melted. Helmi lost nothing. Her 53 cattle survived the storm without a single casualty. She had maintained her normal care routine throughout the crisis, making her tunnel trips every 4 hours to provide water, distribute feed, and monitor conditions. The underground passage had remained fully functional, maintaining consistent temperature and eliminating the wind exposure that represented the primary threat to human survival. While her neighbors fought desperately to save what they could reach, or mourned what they couldn't, she had simply continued her work as if the storm above was happening in a different world entirely. When the wind finally died on the morning of January 12th, Hendricks was the first to reach her homestead. He stood in her kitchen, his bandaged hands cradled against his chest, and asked the question that everyone in the territory wanted answered. "How?" he said. "How did you know?" Helmi poured him coffee and sat down across the table. "I didn't know," she said. "I prepared." The distinction mattered more than any explanation of engineering principles or construction techniques. The tunnel hadn't been built for this specific storm. It had been built for the possibility of storms like this, for the understanding that extreme conditions would eventually arrive regardless of whether anyone predicted them. Preparation wasn't prophecy. It was acknowledging that the worst could happen and building systems that would function when it did. She showed Hendricks the journal, where Aino had sketched his original plans. The drawings were simple: a cross-section of the tunnel, measurements for depth and width, notes about drainage and support spacing. But the thinking behind them was profound. Aino had understood that the problem wasn't cold itself. The problem was exposure. Eliminate exposure, and you eliminate the danger. The tunnel wasn't a way of hiding from winter. It was a way of removing winter from the equation entirely. "Your husband was a smart man," Hendricks said, studying the sketches. "He was a miner," Helmi replied. "He knew what the earth could do for those who knew how to ask." Within a month, 3 other homesteaders in the county had begun planning tunnel systems of their own. Hendricks, his hands still healing, spent hours with Helmi discussing the drainage requirements, support spacing, and waterproofing techniques that had made her passage functional during conditions that had tested every aspect of its design. The measurements and material specifications that had seemed excessive during the planning phase were now recognized as conservative engineering that had provided adequate safety margins when faced with weather beyond the normal range of frontier experience. The Mole Woman wasn't called that anymore. Now they called her something else, a name that spread through the scattered homestead community as survivors shared accounts of who had lived and who had died, and why the differences had mattered. They called her the Woman Who Understood. Helmi lived on her Montana homestead for another 34 years, surviving winters that would have killed her a dozen times over if she had trusted her legs instead of her tunnel. She expanded the passage twice, adding a branch that led to her chicken coop, and another that connected to a root cellar she built halfway between house and barn for storing vegetables through the long, frozen months. When she died in the winter of 1921, peacefully in her bed at the age of 73, her cattle were still alive in the barn 60 yards away. Her grandson found them the next morning, fed and watered, because he had used the tunnel she built to check on them the night before. The passage was still functional. The timbers had settled and the roof planks had weathered. But the drainage worked and the structure held, and the air inside remained calm and survivable when the wind above was trying to kill everything it touched. Some lessons take a long time to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But the cold knows. The cold always knows. And it takes what you fail to protect. Helmi protected everything. And for 34 years, everything survived.